Hello and welcome to another episode of Geared Toward Gear. My name is Sean and I'm so glad you're here. Today we're looking at a knife from Reeve Knives, and it is the small Sebenza 21, the plain edge in the Insingo blade shape. So this is going to be kind of a standard review, but then also kind of talking about the cost of the knife versus the value and kind of what you get for it, to try to come to a conclusion and give you my opinions on whether or not it's worth what you're going to pay for it. And the price on this knife is $375 as of 2019. The large or full-size version is going to cost you about $450. So it's a lot of money to spend on a knife. And here's the knife. It's not in the box. I'll show you what's in the box here in a minute, but we can look at the knife for now. The Sebenza is a knife that I learned about years ago, well over a decade ago, probably 15 years ago at least. And it's kind of looked at by many people as kind of the benchmark of production knives. And like probably many of you, I've seen a million videos and I've looked at them on dealer websites so many times. It's been kind of one of my grail knives for a very long time. I've wanted one for 10 years. And about a month ago, I bought one. I bought mine from Blade HQ. And again, the retail cost is $375. So why would you pay $375 for a knife made of titanium and S35 VN blade steel? Well, it's a good question. It's one worth asking, and I'll try to answer that question during the course of this video. And you can certainly take your own conclusions from it. And kind of make that decision for yourself, whether or not you think it's a total ripoff or if you think it is in fact worth that and has that much value. There's been a number of times in that 10-year period where I probably could have bought this knife, but as you guys all know, sometimes when you're paycheck to paycheck, college student, getting engaged, saving up for an engagement ring, having kids, there hasn't really been a time where I could justify spending the money. And it wasn't until just very recently, about a month ago, that I was in a position where it made sense financially, and I was able to go ahead and make the purchase. So it's one that I'll probably never make again. I've never spent anywhere near that on a knife before, and I probably won't ever again, to be honest with you. Unless I win the lottery, I probably won't buy another Sebenza or anything that costs that much. It's just not something that I can afford to do. And so this is kind of a one-time thing for me, most likely. But I'm very happy with it. I have no regrets. So that's it. The small Sebenza 21. So let's look at the box real quick and just kind of show you what it comes with. Just a basic cardboard box. You get a little envelope that has a Reeve Knives decal, a little kind of born on date that tells you when your knife was made, the materials, the blade shape, a little history on the company, some of the awards that they've won, a registration card, stuff like that. Then you've got a Reeve Knives branded microfiber cloth. It's pretty large, and the knife came wrapped up in that. And then down here you've got some fluorinated grease, which is their lubrication of choice that they recommend, and a hex key for disassembly. They don't use Torx, they use hex, which I actually like, and I'll talk a little more about that later on. So that's the box. You also, on the box, there's a sticker from Crucible, who's the company that makes CPM steels, and I will talk about that as we get into this. So that's the packaging. It's plenty nice. So that's that. But the knife is what's most important. So let's start by kind of doing a general overview review, kind of like I normally would. And I'll try to keep it brief and then really get into cost versus value and whether or not I think that this is worth it. And I've kind of already alluded to the fact that I think it is. I'll explain why, and then you can make your decision. And let me know in the comments once you've watched the whole video whether or not you think this is worth the money or if you think it's a ripoff. To each their own. It's a very polarizing knife. I kind of posed this on a knife group that I'm in on Facebook that said, arguably the most polarizing knife in the knife industry is the Sebenza. Some love them, some hate them, and I was just kind of curious to get people's feedback, and it was kind of mixed. The people that owned them tended to say they're worth it, which I get that, right? If you own it and you spend the money on it, you really want it to be worth the money, and so you're probably going to try a little harder to justify that. I'm going to try to justify it objectively, and not subjectively. So we'll see if I'm able to do that. So let's just talk about the knife as if it were any other knife, and let's start with basic specs. Overall length on the small version is going to be just a hair under 7 inches. You've got a 3-inch blade and a 4-inch handle. So it's a good size for me, kind of my preference. You guys know that at this point. So I really do like the size of the small Sebenza. The blade is going to be what they call the Insingo. It's a kind of a sheep's footy drop point. It's got a satin finish. It has a hollow grind. It has a crowned spine, so the spine is rounded. It's got a tapered swedge towards the tip, which you can see there on both sides. It does have a flat portion up top for any of your consistent angle sharpening systems. And the blade steel, if I didn't mention it, is CPM S35VN. So that's what we're looking at as far as the blade is concerned. The handle is titanium. It's just a slab construction, so 2 pieces of titanium with some pillars and standoffs. And the type of titanium they use is called 6A14V titanium. It's a very high quality titanium. It's they use it a lot in the aerospace industry and the medical industry. So high quality, it's got a good strength, kind of weight to strength ratio, and it's bead blasted. So your finish on the handle scale itself is bead blasted. You can kind of see that iridescence and that sparkle when you catch the light just right. So it's a good looking titanium and good quality. The action or the kind of pivot is bronze washers. So no fancy bearings or anything like that, just simple washers. They are oversized for the size of the knife. You can actually see the bronze washer kind of sticking out right there. They're definitely bigger than they, I guess, need to be technically, or would be on a lot of knives this size, but just basic bronze washers. It's a thumb stud deployment. The way that I prefer to open this is to use this part of my thumb here and put that on the thumb stud and roll it open like that. You can flick it open, but it's not like the buttery smooth drop shut, you know, smooth type of action. It's a very consistent smooth action, but it's not loose in that it's not just going to kind of freely swing or drop shut if you shake it a little bit. So that's what we're looking at as far as the action is concerned. The lock on this is going to be what they call the integral lock, and that's a name that's trademarked by Reeve knives. Most people would know this as a frame lock, and Reeve invented this. So if you've ever owned a frame lock that looks anything like this, you can thank Reeve for that, because he invented that locking mechanism. And it locks up just with the titanium right onto the tang of the blade, so there's no steel insert or ceramic insert for over travel or for the lock face. It's just titanium on steel, and that is your lock. The lockup on this is insane. I will say that, objectively speaking, there's no blade play up and down, which with the quality of these knives, that doesn't surprise me. I have said in a number of videos that you can give me any knife and I can create side-to-side play just by holding it. You know, if you hold it far enough apart and you put enough torque on it, I can create side-to-side play on any knife. I can physically not do that with the Sebenza. And I'll touch more on the tolerances later, but just the way this is constructed and the tolerances that they use, I can literally not make this, as hard as I try, I cannot create any side-to-side blade play. So the lockup is just incredibly strong and solid. So very, very pleased with the lockup. The centering is dead, perfectly centered. I mean, it doesn't, and it's kind of hard and deceiving because there's a little kind of cutout here for the frame lock, so it's a little deceiving when you look at it, but I mean, it is, I mean, just perfectly dead center. If I can get that to focus. Come on now. There we go. It's just dead center. I mean, it doesn't get any more centered than that. So good on the centering. The pocket clip is titanium, bead blasted just like the rest of the knife. It's nested into the frame itself, and it's got kind of 2 points of retention. So you can see the first one being right here, where it would be touching your pants or your shorts or whatever. And then it's got another little dip here. So if you had like thicker material, it's going to actually be interfacing in 2 places. So a very strong, but it's plenty springy. And I mentioned this on another video not too long ago. I think it was the RKO that I reviewed. A lot of titanium pocket clips are just super stiff, but this one's got just the right amount of spring to it. It's a really, really well-designed clip, and it's been a pleasure to carry as far as getting in and out of the pocket. So no complaints on the pocket clip. The clip itself does land on the frame lock itself, and in the new version of this knife that they just announced, which is the Sebenza 31, they've canted that pocket clip to where it sits on the frame itself, but I've had no issues with it in this configuration, so I'm perfectly happy with the pocket clip. It does come with a lanyard from the factory, and it's got this kind of free-floating pivot. You can see the piece of hardware here and on the back side, and then if we get in close enough, you can see that blue tube right there. The lanyard actually passes through that, and the whole thing swivels. So it just kind of moves freely, which is kind of a cool design. I don't know if I'll keep the lanyard on there long-term, because I'm not really a lanyard guy for the most part, but it is what it is, and it functions just fine. So that is the basic kind of down and dirty on the Sebenza as far as specs and, you know, lockup and centering and all that good stuff. It's all good. No complaints about any of it, and there shouldn't be, right? At $375, we shouldn't be talking about a bad pocket clip or it being off center. None of that should frankly be surprising, I don't think, to anybody. I did mention that all the hardware uses a hex hardware, which I really like. And the reason for that is when you're talking about fasteners or hardware of any kind, the fewer points of contact that you have with your driver, the better. So a hex is going to be better than a Torx. A Robertson screw, if any of you do any woodworking, Robertson screw is a square. That's even better than a hex because it's fewer points of contact and less opportunity for your tool to strip the hardware. So I kind of like the fact that it uses hex instead of Torx. So just a kind of fun fact there. The thumb stud is only on one side. So this is a right-handed knife, and that's how I bought it. They make these specifically for left-handed users where everything's literally the opposite. So on my knife, the one that I chose, it has a single thumb stud. You can get dual thumb studs. You can also get them on the left side. This is for tip-up carry only, right hand only. So they're kind of made to be very specific to the user. So that's what we're looking at as far as kind of right versus left-handed carry. So that's the basics on the knife. You know, no complaints as far as the specs and all that stuff is concerned. The performance has been just fine, as you would expect from S35VN blade steel for basic EDC stuff. It performs just perfectly fine. No complaints with the performance. So let's kind of take a step back, talk a little bit about the Sebenza history, about Chris Reeve himself, the company, the evolution of this knife, and why I think it does command that price tag. And just to give a little context before I start, this is a titanium frame lock, right? That's how most people would describe this. It's a titanium frame lock with a good blade steel. Titanium frame locks have been in vogue for a number of years now. It seemed like for a while there that was kind of just all the rage. Everything was a titanium frame lock. And there's a lot of great companies that make titanium frame locks that function essentially the same way with the same steel at half the price or less, right? So just keep that in mind, that there are companies that make titanium frame locks with S35VN steel at half or less than half the price of a Sebenza. So just kind of be thinking about that as I'm talking. So Chris Reeve, he's a South African dude. He's been in the U.S. for years and years. Sebenza, the word or the name of the knife, comes from the Zulu language, and Sebenza means work. That's what the word means. And Chris Reeve is the type of dude that he's just a worker. You know, he's a very hardworking guy. Being from South Africa, living there during a time, without getting too nerded out on history, kind of during apartheid in South Africa, you know, he would have gone through some stuff, and obviously had to work very hard on his knife business that he had in South Africa, but ultimately relocated to the U.S. and started Chris Reeve Knives. And the Sebenza first debuted in 1987, was kind of the very first iteration of this knife. And in 2008, they released the Sebenza 21, which we're looking at currently. And 2008 was 21 years after the original one in 1987, which is why they call it the Sebenza 21. So that's a little history there. So why the hell would this knife cost $375 when you can get, as I mentioned, similar performance, identical materials at less than half the price? Well, there's a few reasons. Let's start with the blade steel. CPM S35VN, a very common steel, a very great steel. But what makes this S35VN better than others? Because it is. And I think that's an objective statement. I don't think I'm making this up. So S30V, which is made by Crucible Industries, Chris Reeve actually helped them develop S30V, the steel itself. And he actually really pushed Crucible to create S35VN because he was looking for a steel that would have a little bit better edge retention, better toughness, and more corrosion resistance than S30V. So he was actually integral in the creation of S35VN. So again, if you own any knife in this steel or any knife with a frame lock, you can thank Chris Reeve for that, because he was pivotal in the invention of the frame lock and the creation of S35VN. The steel they use at Chris Reeve Knives is special in that it's the most consistent, based on independent testing, it's the most consistent S35VN that exists. So not all blade steels are created equal. We've all heard the phrase at one point or another, oh yeah, Buck does great with their 440, or this company does really great with their D2. It's all based on their process, their heat treatment, their quenching. So we've all said it before, there are companies who do certain steels better than other companies do that same steel. And nobody does S35VN the way that Chris Reeve Knives does. That's just a simple fact. Based on, again, independent testing of consistency and hardness. So S35VN, generally speaking, ranges anywhere between 56 and 61 Rockwell in terms of hardness. And that's a pretty wide range. And Chris Reeve Knives pretty much nailed it at 59 to 60. Like every example that comes out of this process is going to be 59 or 60. They've narrowed that margin so precisely with their process for heat treatment that they've created an S35VN blade steel that will perform differently. And when I say differently, I mean better than other S35VN blade steels. So this is objectively better S35VN than you'll find on any other knife, period. That's a generally universally accepted fact, that there is no better S35VN than Chris Reeve Knives. And again, he was one of the ones who kind of helped invent it. So it would make sense that they've just nailed that process down. Next would be the titanium. Just like blade steel, or any material for that matter, they're not all created equal. There's varying qualities in aluminum and G10 and titanium, and they're using a very, very high quality titanium here. So that's going to command a higher price point than some other titaniums might. Also keeping in mind that all these processes that are going into this are being very closely managed by highly skilled craftsmen who are being paid good wages in America, and that is going to raise the price, right? Some of these other knives that I've mentioned, you know, some Chinese manufacturers make great knives with S35VN and titanium, but they're paying much cheaper labor costs. So that's always going to be a factor. When it's USA made, it's going to cost more. Plus all the technology that they use to achieve the consistency in their blades, to achieve the insane tolerances, which we'll talk about. It comes at a price. So let's talk a little bit about tolerances. People talk a lot about, you know, Sebenzas just have the best tolerances. The tolerances are so tight. Everything's just kind of fit together beautifully. And I will say from my experience and everything I've read and videos I've watched, interviews, shop tours, that is in fact the case. The tolerances and the processes that go into making this knife are insane. Again, they use a lot of high-tech machinery, you know, whether it be a CNC machine or a you know, surface grinder. These titanium slabs are perfectly parallel, plumb, flush, and the tolerances are so precise and tight with the fitment of the scale to the blade to the washers. That's where you get that zero blade play. It's just made where it's impossible to create blade play because the tolerances are so insanely tight. In some cases down to like 0.2 of 1/1000th of an inch, which would be like 1/10 the thickness of a human hair. The thumb stud, for example, is press fit. There's no hardware to remove it. It is press fit. And the tolerances that it takes to drill those holes so precisely for something as simple as the thumb stud, let alone the pivot, is not easy. And they've got it dialed in so precisely. And if it's off by, I mean, a micron, it's just not going to work. And so they take extraordinary care in the precision machining and fitment of all of their parts to create a final product that has just the most consistency in its construction. Another example would be the lockup here. So although it's titanium on steel, you can find reports all over the internet of people who have measured the distance. If you measure the distance between the frame lock on this side and the frame on this side, there have been people who have measured that distance with a micrometer and then measured it again like 8 years later, and it's identical, meaning that lock bar has traveled not one bit. Again, because the tolerances are so tight on this that it just doesn't move. It stays in place for a very, very long time. Most frame locks are not going to last that long. They're going to over travel. They're going to slip all the way to the right-hand side, and you know, that just doesn't happen with Sebenzas. Another thing is the grind on this blade. So as I mentioned, it's a hollow grind, but the profile is unique in that it's quite a bit thinner behind the edge than it is at the actual bevel. And so what that creates is a profile that allows you to get more longevity out of this knife. So this literally has a longer lifespan than many other knives. This should literally last you your entire life. Whereas some other knives, as you sharpen them back, they get thicker and thicker. That doesn't really happen with Sebenzas because the way the grind is, and it's very subtle, and it's not something I can really show you, but it's just, it's hard to explain. So the profile, if you're looking at it like a cross section, where the the actual bevel is, it widens and then it goes into its hollow grind. So they give you room to sharpen. So as you sharpen it back, you're not thickening that behind the edge thickness by much, if at all. So your cutting performance is not going to be affected after, years, 20, 30, 40, 50 sharpenings. Your blade profile is going to basically be the same. And that's not the case with most knives. Most knives, as you sharpen them, the behind the edge thickness gets thicker. And they have built in, with the way they do their hollow grind, that extra material to allow you to maintain that precise edge over a long period of time. And that is not easy to do. And the processes, again, that go into allowing that to happen are not cheap. Then add in the fact that this basically has a forever warranty, almost no questions asked, right? So I can send this in anytime in the future, and they will completely refinish it, essentially. They'll re-bead blast it, they'll sharpen it, they'll tune it up, they'll lube it up, replace a thumb stud, whatever, at no cost to me other than maybe some shipping. The other thing to note is that this design has been around since 1987 in one form or another. Okay, so I don't think it's going anywhere, meaning I'm confident that in 20 years, I can send this back to Chris Reeve Knives and they will take care of me. Other knives, they get discontinued. They stop making them. Companies go out of business. I don't have that fear with Chris Reeve Knives. I'm confident that I'll be taken care of for the life of this knife. And again, that kind of adds to the value of the knife. You can't necessarily I guess you could put a dollar value on it, but it's kind of one of those intangibles that people don't think about, is that this knife is not going anywhere and they're going to take care of you for life. So the warranty, the customer service factor, that's worth something. And so all things considered, the tolerances, the grind, the steel, the performance, to me makes it worth that cost. And that's my basic thoughts. I've got a couple minor complaints about the knife. I don't like the hole in the presentation scale. And they actually got rid of that on the updated version, the Sebenza 31. So that's no longer there. It's just flat, which I think is a good change. I also don't love the lanyard placement, in that sometimes when I close the blade, if you'll notice, if I rotate the lanyard, I can basically rotate it right into the blade. So like right now, the blade tip is in the lanyard. So it's kind of started to fray, as you can see. So I don't fully understand that, but that's one minor complaint. The whole aesthetically, I don't love. I kind of wish it was like crazy buttery smooth, but again, the consistency in the deployment and closing, it's like the same amount of force throughout the entire travel, because it's just so precisely machined and those tolerances are so tight. And that I appreciate, that's going to stay in place. And it will loosen up a little bit over time. And if I disengage the frame lock, it'll drop a little bit, but plenty smooth, and the performance has been great. I've used the hell out of this thing for the last month. I've had to clean the blade up a number of times because it's got really gunked up. And ergonomically speaking, some knives, like here's a random Kubi knife that I have sitting nearby. See how contoured that handle is? Very ergonomic, right? It just melts into my hand. Absolutely melts in my hand. Super, super comfortable. This handle is very plain Jane, kind of straight lines. It doesn't fill your hand, but when you really bear down on it, there's nothing to create a hot spot. So some knives that are really heavily contoured, if you really bear down, certain parts of it could create hot spots, whether it's the texturing in the back or, an area that sticks up a little more than others when you're really cranking down on it. So like when I squeeze this knife in a hammer grip as hard as I can, I get a couple hot spots. Nothing terrible, but definitely a couple hot spots. With the Sebenza, with everything being just kind of chamfered and not really having any, really much ergonomics to it, when I bear down on this and squeeze as hard as I can, I don't really feel anything because it's just flat. There's nothing protruding anywhere. So when I was breaking down a bunch of cardboard to put in recycling, it was just very comfortable in a really strong kind of hard use grip. And then for EDC stuff, you know, cutting an apple, opening packages, I mean, the ergonomics are a non-issue. It's very comfortable. The jimping is very precisely machined. I can ignore it if I want to and let my finger go past it. But if I want it to be functional, it is very functional. So just everything is executed well. I think it's fantastic design. It's obviously stood the test of time. I am honored and grateful to have had the opportunity to purchase one, and this thing is going to go on a journey. Once I'm done filming this, I'm going to wrap this thing up, literally, and ship it off to a few other YouTubers to take a look at. So it's going to go to Big Red EDC first. Then it'll be going to both Zach's stuff and Grateful Panic knife reviews. So JB, Zach, and John are all going to get their hands on this knife. I'm going to send it on its way on an airplane. Well, maybe not an airplane, but I'm going to pack it up, ship it off, and let them take a look at it, see how they feel about it. Because at the end of the day, I decided very quickly with this knife, I'm going to use the hell out of it. I'm going to let other people use it. I don't care if it gets scratched up and dinged. You know, I could buy a decent handgun for the price of this knife. So I'm not going to let it sit around and not get used. So it's going on an airplane or on a truck or whatever to a few other people to get their thoughts on it, see how they like it or don't like it. And that's fine if they feel that way. But I just want to get in the hands of some other people to get their thoughts. I think it'll be interesting to see a few different perspectives on this knife from people who have either not owned one, not handled one, or only maybe handled one once or twice. And I had never put my hands or eyes on one until this thing arrived at my door. So it's going to be going off to see a few people, visit a couple of my friends. And like I said, like if, you know, for example, and I'm not calling you out, JB, but if Big Red EDC is out in the garden, he drops this thing and it puts a little love mark on the titanium, then guess what? Every time I look at it, I'll remember the time that I got to send this knife to my friend and he got to use it. So I could frankly care less if it gets a little dinged up. I want them to use it. I want them to carry it. And I want to hear their thoughts, whether they fall in love with it or if they conclude that it's just not for them and that they wouldn't personally spend that kind of money on it. It's totally cool. You know, it is what it is. It's all personal preference and taste at the end of the day, but I am enjoying it quite a bit. And I think this will be part of my EDC rotation for a very, very long time. So those are my thoughts on the CRK Chris Reeve knives, small Sebenza 21 Insingo. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and I'll talk to you soon.